Good morning, friends. Hope you had a great weekend and a great Monday and Tuesday. Welcome to Elaine, Jens, Bradley, Ayla, Sarah, and Galaxy. Good to see you, friends. So today we will be studying the second part of the Chula Vidala Sutta with Bhante Suddhaso, and you can find the link in the live chat. And of course, good morning to Bhante Suddhaso. And hello to Geeta and Michael, welcome. All right, so I'll pass it on to Bhante so we can start.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends, and welcome back to Sutta study. Today we'll be doing the second half of the Chula Vedala Sutta, the lesser series of questions and answers. So we had just left off with the description of the three sankharas, and we're starting on the section on cessation of recognition and feeling. That's sanya vedayata nirodha. So sanya vedayata nirodha, the cessation of recognition and feeling, is a state of samadhi which is only accessible to people who have completely eliminated sensual desire and aversion. In other words, it's only accessible to non-returners and arhats. And it's said to be the closest one can get to immersion in parinibbana while still being alive. So I'll resume the sutta. So the layman Visakha asks Venerable Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī, he asks her, "Noble lady, how is there the attainment of the cessation of recognition and feeling?" And she answers, "Sir Visakha, when a monk is attaining the cessation of recognition and feeling, it does not occur to him, I will attain the cessation of recognition and feeling, or I am attaining the cessation of recognition and feeling, or I have attained the cessation of recognition and feeling. Rather, it is the prior development of his mind that guides it to that state." In other words, when one is entering this deep state of samadhi, the cessation of recognition and feeling, since there is no recognition going on, the recognition process of the mind has stopped. Basically, all mental activity completely stops, both coarse and subtle. So there's no recognition that one is in the cessation of recognition and feeling. It's just not possible. There's no awareness of it at all. So naturally, then one doesn't think, I am entering this state or in this state, and also one doesn't even have a subconscious or nonverbal recognition of that state because there's no recognition at all. So the cessation of recognition and feeling, similar to the attainment of neither perception nor non-perception, the fourth of the formless attainments, these two states of samadhi have in common that one is completely unaware while in that state. And it's only after emerging from the state that one is able to reflect on it and see what happened, and to see what change occurred in the mind. So for this reason, these two states of samadhi, so the cessation of recognition and feeling and the attainment of neither perception or non-perception, these two states of samadhi are not considered particularly useful in a Buddhist perspective because it's impossible to develop wisdom while in these states. Since the mind is not functioning, then you can't do anything. It's kind of like being in a very deep sleep. So then Sir Visakha asks, "Noble lady, when a monk is attaining the cessation of recognition and feeling, what phenomena cease first? The body formation, the speech formation, or the mind formation?" So previously I had said that these terms, kaya sankhara, vachi sankhara, and chitta sankhara, might be better translated as physical activity, verbal activity, and mental activity. That might be a better translation here for these terms. And so Venerable Dhammadinnā replies, Sarvasaka, when a monk is attaining the cessation of recognition and feeling, the verbal activity ceases first, then the physical activity, then the mental activity. So in other words, first the verbal activity stops, which she had defined earlier as verbal thought. So not speech per se, but verbal thought. So vitakka and vichara. So vitakka is active verbal thought, and vichara is non-verbal thought. So it's movements of mind. So first the coarser levels of mental activity stop, which is the active thinking component of mind. Then the physical activity stops, so the body becomes completely still, and even breathing stops. So she had mentioned earlier that breathing is part of the kaya sankhara, the physical activities. So the body comes to a complete standstill and the breathing stops entirely. Then the mind formation, then the mental activities, both coarse and subtle, all mental activity also completely stops. So then he asks, Noble lady, how is there emergence from the cessation of recognition and feeling? In other words, how do you come out of this state of samadhi? And she replies, Sarvasaka, when a monk is emerging from the cessation of recognition and feeling, it does not occur to him, I will emerge from the cessation of recognition and feeling, or I am emerging from the cessation of recognition and feeling, or I have emerged from the cessation of recognition and feeling. Rather, it is the prior development of his mind that guides it to that state. So again, emphasizing here that both entering and leaving the cessation of recognition and feeling is dependent upon one's prior development of mind. In other words, what did you do with your mind beforehand? So when one sets up the mind to lean towards the cessation of all physical and mental activity, then when the conditions are right, that will happen. And the amount of time that it lasts for is dependent upon one's prior karma. And then eventually it ends on its own. So this is a bit different from jhanas, for example. So jhanas continue dependent upon one's ongoing effort to stay on the meditation object. So it's a bit different with the cessation of recognition and feeling. Since there's no mental activity at all, that also means there is no ongoing effort to stay in that state of samadhi. It persists only as long as one's prior karma allows it to persist, and then it comes to an end on its own. And Sarvasaka asks, Noble lady, when a monk is emerging from the cessation of recognition and feeling, what phenomena arise first? Physical activity, verbal activity, or mental activity? And she replies, Sarvasaka, when a monk is emerging from the cessation of recognition and feeling, mental activity arises first, then physical activity, then verbal activity. So the opposite of when one is entering. And he asks, Sarvasaka, noble lady, when a monk has emerged from the cessation of recognition and feeling, how many kinds of contact touch him? And she replies, Sarvasaka, when a monk has emerged from the cessation of recognition and feeling, 3 kinds of contact touch him: emptiness contact, objectless contact, and undirected contact. So that's sunyata, anamitta, and apanahita. So this is quite interesting in that she's saying that when one emerges from the state of samadhi, then one's mind naturally inclines towards the perception of emptiness, the perception of objectlessness or formlessness, and towards being undirected. In other words, one doesn't try to incline the mind towards anything in particular. So the mind is in a resting state, a state of deep contentment and stillness. Then Sarvasaka asks, noble lady, when a monk has emerged from the cessation of recognition and feeling, what does his mind tend, lean, and incline towards? And she answers, Sarvasaka, when a monk has emerged from the cessation of recognition and feeling, his mind tends towards seclusion, leans towards seclusion, inclines towards seclusion. So the Pali word here is viveka. It's the word for seclusion. There's two forms of seclusion. So one is physical seclusion, which means to literally be alone physically, be apart from other humans physically. And the other is chitta viveka, so mental seclusion, which means having a mind which is unaffected by what's going on around you, a mind which is not disturbed or agitated or bothered, no matter what happens around you. So the Buddha mentions this elsewhere in the suttas. And he says that, of course, mental seclusion is the best. Because with mental seclusion, it doesn't matter whether you're alone or around other people. Your mind will always be undisturbed. So that's what we're really working to develop, is the mind which is undisturbed, whether we're alone or with others. So that's the end of the section on the cessation of recognition and feeling. If that all seems too abstract and far out, that's okay, because realistically, if you're not a non-returner, you don't really need to worry about the state of cessation of recognition and feeling. And if you are a non-returner, then you're so close to enlightenment, you don't really need to worry about anything. So personally, when I read about the cessation of recognition and feeling, I'm kind of like, okay, I mean, that's all lovely and wonderful. But I'm more interested in how I can get to stream entry. And cessation of recognition and feeling will come when the time is right, which is probably not going to be any time soon for me. So then, switching topics, Sarvasaka asks, noble lady, how many kinds of feeling are there? So feeling is Vedana. How many kinds of Vedana are there? And she answers, Sarvasaka, there are 3 kinds of feeling: pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neutral feeling. So the 3 kinds of Vedana: Sukha Vedana, Dukkha Vedana, and Adukkama Sukha Vedana. And he asks, noble lady, what is pleasant feeling? What is unpleasant feeling? What is neutral feeling? And she answers, Sarvasaka, anything, physical or mental, that is felt as pleasant and agreeable is pleasant feeling. Anything, physical or mental, that is felt as unpleasant and disagreeable is unpleasant feeling. Anything, physical or mental, that is felt as neither agreeable nor disagreeable is neutral feeling. Very simple definition. The main important thing here is she's emphasizing that it can be either physical or mental. So then Sarvasaka asks, noble lady, in regard to pleasant feeling, what is pleasant and what is unpleasant? In regard to unpleasant feeling, what is pleasant and what is unpleasant? In regard to neutral feeling, what is pleasant and what is unpleasant? And she gives a very interesting answer here. She says, Sarvasaka, a pleasant feeling is pleasant when it is stable and unpleasant when it changes. An unpleasant feeling is unpleasant when it is stable and pleasant when it changes. A neutral feeling is pleasant when there is knowledge and unpleasant when there is no knowledge. So in other words, when we're having something pleasant, a pleasant feeling, then we're happy as long as it seems to be persistent and reliable. But when it starts to change, then it's disturbing to us. It's disturbing that we're losing our pleasant feeling, our pleasant experience. So an unpleasant feeling is unpleasant when it's stable. So when it seems like the painful or unpleasant feeling is persisting, then that makes us unhappy, disturbs us. But when it looks like the unpleasant feeling is changing, then we get happy. That makes us happy, and it brings pleasure. So this is interesting because it's not necessarily the complete disappearance of the pain, but rather the recognition that the pain is impermanent and changing that brings happiness to the mind. So this is one of the ways of dealing with pain, by the way, is to pay full attention to the pain and recognize that the pain is impermanent, constantly changing, not stable, not steady, not persistent. And recognizing the impermanence, the changingness of the unpleasant sensation, then removes the unpleasantness of it. And then finally she says, a neutral feeling is pleasant when there is knowledge and unpleasant when there is no knowledge. In other words, if we pay full attention to neutral feelings, then that brings joy and happiness to the mind. This is a subtle form of pleasure, a subtle form of happiness. And there's another sutta where the Buddha describes neutral feeling as a subtle form of pleasant feeling. And this is where, in this case, Venerable Dhammadinnā gives some explanation of how that can be. So when we're fully aware of a neutral feeling, then it's pleasant. We know exactly what's going on. There's no surprises. There's nothing which can shock us or catch us off guard. But on the other hand, a neutral feeling, when we don't understand it, when we don't see it clearly, then that's unpleasant. It creates a sense of tension and fear in the mind, a sense of unsteadiness and uncertainness, a sense that we might be caught off guard by something that we can't handle. And the other thing also is recognizing that anywhere that we have blind spots in our experience is a place where our defilements can operate, a place where our defilements can grow and get worse and worse. So it's necessary to be clearly aware of neutral feeling, though our tendency is to ignore neutral feeling. But through a Buddhist practice, we need to learn how to pay full attention to neutral feeling as well. In fact, Ajahn Sumedho says that 90% of our experience is neutral, which means that if we're not paying attention to neutral feeling, then we're missing out on most of our life. So Sarvasaka asks, Noble Lady, what tendency accompanies a pleasant feeling? What tendency accompanies an unpleasant feeling? What tendency accompanies a neutral feeling? And she replies, Sarvasaka, the tendency towards lust accompanies a pleasant feeling. The tendency towards aversion accompanies an unpleasant feeling. The tendency towards ignorance accompanies a neutral feeling. Again, this is quite easy to relate to. So the tendency towards lust accompanies a pleasant feeling. What this means is that whenever we experience something pleasant, something enjoyable, then we have a tendency to get obsessed with it, to be filled with desire and attachment towards it, to want more of it, want it to continue. The tendency towards aversion accompanying an unpleasant feeling. So what this means is, again, whenever we experience something painful or disturbing, then we want it to end. We hate it. We get caught up in discontent, disliking. And finally, the tendency towards ignorance accompanies a neutral feeling. So as I mentioned before, neutral feelings, because they seem uninteresting, they seem boring, they don't provoke a strong emotional response in us, then we mostly ignore them. We just don't pay any attention. But it's necessary to be fully aware of neutral feeling in order to cultivate wisdom and clear awareness, in order to not be disturbed or caught off guard. Then Sarvasaka asks, Noble Lady, does the tendency towards lust accompany all pleasant feelings? Does the tendency towards aversion accompany all unpleasant feelings? Does the tendency towards ignorance accompany all neutral feelings? She replies, Sarvasaka, the tendency towards lust does not accompany all pleasant feelings. The tendency towards aversion does not accompany all unpleasant feelings. The tendency towards ignorance does not accompany all neutral feelings. In other words, just because we're having a pleasant feeling doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be filled with desire and obsession and attachment. It's possible to feel a pleasant feeling without being attached to it, without being obsessed with it, without wanting it to continue. So having equanimity towards pleasant feeling, recognizing that it's here, recognizing that it's happening, but not being obsessed with it, not getting wrapped up in it. And the tendency towards aversion does not accompany all unpleasant feelings. Similarly, just because there's an unpleasant feeling happening, so whether it's pain or grief or whatever it is, just because there's some unpleasant feeling happening, doesn't mean that we need to hate it or dislike it or reject it. We can be fully aware of a painful feeling without being disturbed by it and without wanting it to go away, just recognizing it for what it is. Just another conditional arising. Something that happens when the causes and conditions are right for it to happen, and that ceases when the causes and conditions are right for it to cease. So just seeing it as part of the changing scenery of samsara, not something that we need to be disturbed by or bothered by. And finally, the tendency towards ignorance does not accompany all neutral feelings. In other words, we aren't necessarily going to want to ignore every neutral feeling that arises. There can be clear awareness. There can be mindfulness and full understanding of neutral feeling as they come and go. It takes training. We have to train the mind to pay full attention. We have to train the mind to be clearly, sharply aware of what's going on in every moment. If we don't train the mind to be fully, sharply aware, then we will tend to ignore neutral feeling, tend to be deluded about neutral feeling. And where delusion grows, then dukkha grows. Then he asks, noble lady, what should be abandoned in regard to a pleasant feeling? What should be abandoned in regard to an unpleasant feeling? What should be abandoned in regard to a neutral feeling? And she answers, Sarvasaka, lust should be abandoned in regard to a pleasant feeling. Aversion should be abandoned in regard to an unpleasant feeling. Ignorance should be abandoned in regard to a neutral feeling. So again, this is pretty straightforward, as we mentioned before. So if we do have desire and lust and obsession towards pleasant feelings, then we need to drop that. We need to let go of it. If we do have aversion and hatred and dislike towards unpleasant feelings, then we need to work on letting go of that as well. So in both cases, cultivating equanimity. So if a pleasant feeling comes, then we see it as impermanent, as subject to change, as unreliable, as not being something which we can depend upon for happiness. So we watch as it comes and goes, without being elated by its appearance and without being disturbed by its disappearance. Similarly, with unpleasant feelings, we recognize them as conditional, as temporary, as unstable. So when they arise, we just see, oh, this is a temporary thing which has come about because the conditions are right for it to appear. It's not me, it's not mine. I don't need to be disturbed by it. It's a choice to be disturbed by it, so I will choose to not be disturbed by it. And we watch as it comes and goes, not being disturbed when it arises and not being elated when it disappears. Just recognizing it as the changing scenery of samsara. It's kind of like when you're riding in a vehicle, and one moment you're passing a beautiful park, and then the next you're passing a landfill, and then the next you're passing a monument, and then the next you're passing a dirty alleyway. It's like, well, it's just the changing scenery of the city. And it's not good or bad. It's just the nature of a city is that it has both pleasant things and unpleasant things. So it's the same as we go through life. Sometimes we feel pleasant things and sometimes we feel unpleasant feelings. That's just the changing scenery of samsara. We don't need to be bothered or obsessed with whatever comes and goes. And finally, once again, ignorance should be abandoned in regard to neutral feeling. So we need to make sure that we're paying full attention to every aspect of our experience, even the parts that we normally consider uninteresting. We need to take an interest in even what is uninteresting. And when we do that, then it becomes interesting. So things are interesting when we take an interest in them. This is a very important point. So then Sarvasaka asks, noble lady, does lust need to be abandoned in regard to all pleasant feelings? Does aversion need to be abandoned in regard to all unpleasant feelings? Does ignorance need to be abandoned in regard to all neutral feelings? In other words, do all pleasant feelings, no matter what they are, do we need to abandon our desire for them? And all unpleasant feelings, no matter what they are, do we need to abandon our aversion towards them? And all neutral feelings, whatever they are, do we need to abandon our ignorance towards them? And you would think the answer here would be yes. But Dhammadinnā comes in with a surprising response. She says, Sarvasaka, lust does not need to be abandoned in regard to all pleasant feelings. Aversion does not need to be abandoned in regard to all unpleasant feelings. Ignorance does not need to be abandoned in regard to all neutral feelings. So what is she talking about here? So she says, Sarvasaka, in this case, a monk who is secluded from sensuality and from unwholesome phenomena attains and remains in the first jhana, which has thought and consideration, and the rapture and happiness produced by seclusion. By means of that, lust is abandoned. The tendency towards lust does not accompany that. This is very interesting. So again, Sarvasaka asks, does lust need to be abandoned in regard to all pleasant feelings? And she says no. And the example she gives is the first jhana. So when one attains jhana, so these deep states of strong samadhi, in which one abandons ordinary sensual desire and enters fully into mental unification, those are extremely pleasant states of mind, extremely pleasant experiences. But ordinary sensual lust has disappeared. There can still be desire for jhana and attachment to the pleasure of jhana, but she says this is a form of pleasant feeling which one does not need to abandon one's desire for. Because it's a completely wholesome state of mind which is supportive to attaining awakening. So again, here we have an example of jhana being held up as something which is not to be avoided. And also pointing out that the desire for the pleasure of jhana, attachment to the pleasure of jhana, is not necessarily an obstacle on the path to awakening. In fact, it supports us on the path to awakening because it encourages us to train our mind, to develop our meditation practice, to build up the strong samadhi that we need in order to develop strong insight. And the second one, so dealing with unpleasant feelings, she says, Sarvasaka, in this case, a monk reflects in this way. When will I attain and remain in that state of being which the noble ones have attained and now remain in? So I didn't say that in the proper tone of voice. Let me say that again. Oh, when will I attain and remain in that state of being which the noble ones have attained and now remain in? So this lament of like, oh, when will I attain awakening? When will I be free of this painful existence of samsara? Woe is me, stuck in this unenlightened state of defilement and delusion. When will I be free of this? So those who have been practicing Buddhism for some time might be familiar with this state of mind. That state of mind where one recognizes how deeply one is mired in defilement and delusion. And there's this strong longing. I want to be free of this. I want to attain awakening. I want to get out of this. I hate all of this dukkha. I hate this dukkha. I hate it. So that strong depression or disturbance or downheartedness of mind. So elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha calls this the depression of a renunciant, the downheartedness of a renunciant. And the Buddha identifies it as a wholesome state of mind. And it's wholesome because it fuels our bodhicitta. It fuels our aspiration for awakening. It fuels our drive towards awakening. So although it's an unpleasant state of mind characterized by aversion, it's a form of aversion and unpleasantness which leads us towards awakening. So it's not necessarily a problem because it propels us along the path. So she says, with the establishment of longing for unsurpassed liberation, dejection arises on account of that longing. So as I was saying, so it's like, I want to attain awakening. I hate not being awakened. I want it to stop. So is that aversion? Yes. However, it is a form of aversion which leads towards awakening. So she says, by means of that, aversion is abandoned. Because one is cultivating that wish for awakening, which means one is working on abandoning all the ordinary forms of aversion, which are obstacles on the path. She says, the tendency towards aversion does not accompany that. Again, this is abandoning the ordinary aversion. It's actually aversion towards aversion. And aversion towards aversion leads towards the elimination of all aversion. And then the third example, she says, Sarvasaka, in this case, with the abandoning of pleasure, the abandoning of pain, and the previous disappearance of elation and dejection, a monk attains and remains in the fourth jhana, which is neither unpleasant nor pleasant, and has purity of equanimity and mindfulness. By means of that, ignorance is abandoned. The tendency towards ignorance does not accompany that. So this is the supreme state of neutral feeling, which is fourth jhana, when the mind has perfect equanimity, but also perfect mindfulness. Again, this is a very important thing to point out. So as the jhanas are described in the suttas, they are accompanied by extreme, sharp, precise mindfulness, extreme, sharp, precise awareness. So the four jhanas are not dull, blank, hazy states of mind. They are not sleepy, foggy states of mind. They are incredibly bright, sharp, awake, alert states of mind. And in fourth jhana, she's pointing here to the fact that in fourth jhana, one is clearly, sharply aware of all of one's sensations. So all those neutral sensations, which we normally tend to ignore, in fourth jhana, we are intensely, precisely aware of all of them, all of neutral feeling. Which is why the tendency towards ignorance does not accompany the state of mind in fourth jhana. So then we have a series of questions on counterpart. So this is a word in Pali, patibhaga, which is a very difficult word to translate effectively, especially here, because in this sequence, the word patibhaga is used in two different ways. So counterpart is a clumsy attempt to try to capture both meanings of the word patibhaga. So I'll go ahead and read through this sequence, and then I'll explain what's going on here after I've read through the whole section. So Sarvasaka asks, noble lady, what is the counterpart of pleasant feeling? Sarvasaka, the counterpart of pleasant feeling is unpleasant feeling. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of unpleasant feeling? So Visakha, the counterpart of unpleasant feeling is pleasant feeling. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of neutral feeling? So Visakha, the counterpart of neutral feeling is ignorance. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of ignorance? So Visakha, the counterpart of ignorance is knowledge. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of knowledge? So Visakha, the counterpart of knowledge is liberation. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of liberation? So Visakha, the counterpart of liberation is nibbana. Noble lady, what is the counterpart of nibbana? So Visakha, you have overstepped the bounds of inquiry. You were not able to understand the limitations of inquiries. So Visakha, the spiritual life merges into nibbana, ends at nibbana, concludes with nibbana. So just some explanation here on counterpart. So in the first part here, counterpart means opposite. So what's the opposite of pleasant feeling? Well, it's unpleasant feeling. What's the opposite of unpleasant feeling? It's pleasant feeling. So counterpart here, it can also mean what accompanies. So what's the partner? So pleasant feeling is partnered with unpleasant feeling. Unpleasant feeling is partnered with pleasant feeling. And then similarly, neutral feeling. Neutral feeling is partnered with ignorance feeling, with ignorance. It's associated with ignorance. And then what's the counterpart of ignorance? And here it's, again, flipping back to the meaning of opposite. What's the opposite of ignorance? The opposite of ignorance is knowledge. So this is, again, flipping the meaning of this word. So this is a case where, again, something makes a lot more sense in Pali, and in translation, it always comes out a little bit awkward because they're playing with the double meaning of a word. And then what is the counterpart of knowledge? The counterpart of knowledge is liberation. So here it's implying sequence. So here Patibhaga is implying like what's next, what's the result, what's the continuation. So there's actually a third layer of meaning here to this word, which is brought out in this sequence. So from knowledge there comes liberation, from liberation there comes nibbana. And he asks, well, what comes after nibbana? And she's like, okay, clearly, like, she's like, you're doing great up until now, but now you just demonstrated that you don't know what you're talking about. She's like, there is nothing beyond nibbana. There is no step after nibbana. Nibbana is the conclusion. So with full immersion into nibbana, that's the completion of the spiritual life. That's the final attainment which can be attained. So you can also see this as a sequence of development. So first there's understanding, pleasant and unpleasant. And then with neutral feeling, one tends to fall into ignorance. So one cultivates knowledge, one cultivates awareness and wisdom and understanding. And that awareness and wisdom and understanding leads to liberation from one's defilements, liberation from desire and aversion. And liberation then naturally leads to nibbana, so full enlightenment, complete immersion in the deathless, the unconditioned, the formless. So then Venerable Dhammadinnā says, Sir Visakha, if you wish, you may approach the Blessed One and ask him about this matter. You may remember it in whatever way the Blessed One explains it. In other words, she's saying, if you don't believe me, go and ask the Buddha. So then the lay disciple Visakha, delighted and rejoiced in Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī's speech, rose from his seat and venerated Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī. Having done what was appropriate, he approached the Blessed One. After approaching and venerating the Blessed One, he sat to one side. When he was seated to one side, the lay disciple Visakha reported his conversation with Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī to the Blessed One. When this was said, the Blessed One said to Visakha, Visakha, Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī is wise. Visakha, Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī has great wisdom. Visakha, if you had asked me about that matter, I would have explained it in the same way that Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī explained it. That is the meaning of it, remember it in that way. In other words, he says, yeah, she got it. She nailed it. This is what the Blessed One said. Satisfied, the lay disciple Visakha delighted in the Blessed One's statement. So that's the end of this sutta. So lots of delicious Dharma candy here. Lots of tasty little sections touching on a number of points. At this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them, and we'll have some conversation. Okay.
Thank you so much, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. What a remarkable sutta. I know we always say this, but
it's one of my favorites.
It's the Pali Canon. And welcome also to some friends who joined us in the meanwhile. Hello, Edward, Mark, Marielle, Rich, Grant, and Sarah. Good to see you all. So Michael has quite a few questions.
Oh, wonderful.
So Michael was saying earlier on, perhaps give us a couple examples of neutral feeling. It's counterintuitive, at least to my mind. From where I sit now, I see trees. I like trees, pleasant feeling. But I also see building construction, fences, ugly, unpleasant feeling. I also see all kinds of things that hardly register on my mind. No feeling or neutral feelings?
That's probably neutral feeling. So again, the majority of our experience is neutral. So neutral feeling is any sensory experience which we do not react to with either desire or aversion. It's any sensory experience which we neither like nor dislike. So for example, the air in this room, it doesn't register as either pleasant or unpleasant. It registers as neutral. The carpet, I don't particularly like it or dislike it. It just registers as neutral. Whereas the lovely stone wall in the back of the Dharma hall, I really like it. It's great. Pretty stones arranged very neatly in a slightly chaotic pattern. It's actually quite lovely. So you can see then how there are, as we pay closer and closer attention to our experience, we can actually see lots of neutral feeling. So for example, clothing against the skin is commonly a neutral feeling. But as Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī pointed out, when a neutral feeling is fully known, then it's pleasant. It's a very slight, pleasant feeling. So when we bring full mindfulness to a neutral feeling, then it starts to register as slightly pleasant. So that can also throw things off a little bit. But start paying full attention to things that you're not drawn to. So we tend to focus our attention on things that are either distinctly pleasant or distinctly unpleasant. And we tend to not pay much attention to things which are neither particularly pleasant or unpleasant. So try to draw your attention to things that are neither particularly pleasant or unpleasant, and you'll start to realize what neutral feeling feels like. And again, as Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī points out, if we don't pay attention to neutral feeling, then it actually feels kind of like slightly unpleasant. But if we pay full attention to it, then it becomes a little pleasant, a little bit kind of nice. Okay?
So could that be basically you're only bored if you're not mindful?
Yeah, exactly.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
And Michael also says, eating a pleasant meal engenders pleasant feelings. Seems to me developing awareness of this is not the same as rejecting the pleasant feeling. Best to just enjoy the meal and afterward, no longing or clinging. Is this delusion on my part?
You're halfway there. So also while eating the meal, you should also be watching your mind. And if your mind is going into, I really like this, I want this to continue, I don't want this to stop, well, that's a problem. Because then that's what fuels the obsessiveness in the mind, which creates dukkha. So instead, you can recognize this is a pleasant feeling, it is enjoyable, and it is impermanent, it is changing, it is subject to cessation, and that's totally okay, and I'm not the least bit bothered with this sensation changing and ending. So you can sit down to a pleasant meal with a peaceful mind. So not thinking, oh, I really want this, yay, Nutella, yay. And then you start eating. and you're aware that it's pleasant, but you're not going like, oh my God, this is so delicious, I love this. You're just eating like, yeah, it's pleasant, yeah. And then the meal comes to an end and you're like, again, the meal ends and you're not like, oh, how sad, now the meal is over and I can't eat anything for a few hours. Instead, it's just like, yeah, okay, meal's over, no problem. So you want to keep a peaceful mind from beginning to end. So not getting caught up in anticipation and craving beforehand, not getting caught up in obsession and attachment while it's happening, and not getting caught up in nostalgia and longing after it's over.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Elaine says, the enunciate depression characterizes me. Next time I start wailing about how this experience does not pass, rather feels permanent, I will rejoice in it as it is keeping me on the path.
Yeah.
Is this right thinking?
Yeah, that's correct. One of these days I'll go through that sutta as well, the one on the elation, depression, and equanimity of the householder, and elation, depression, and equanimity of the renunciant. It's a really wonderful sutta. Yeah.
All right. And Michael says, wonderful. Thank you, Bhante. It's like walking meditation where we become aware of our walking in ways we normally don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. Actually, walking is something which is often in a category of ignorance, because we walk all the time, so we just don't pay any attention to it.
And Eva asks, is guilt a feeling and how do we deal with it?
Yeah, guilt is a mental feeling, an emotional feeling. So it fit in the mental category rather than the physical category. Sometimes there's physical correlates to emotions, but emotion is predominantly a mental experience. So you deal with it the same way you deal with any other emotion. So you notice that it's happening, you notice what's present, you pay full attention to it, but you also recognize this is not me, this is not mine, this does not define me, this does not control me. This has arisen based upon conditions. It will cease. In fact, if you pay close attention, you'll see it's already shifting and changing and coming to an end. And also look more closely. What is the experience of guilt? Is it wholesome or is it unwholesome? Does it have wholesome components? Does it have unwholesome components? Look more closely. So guilt often contains a mixture of wholesome and unwholesome components. So there's often a wholesome component of recognizing right and wrong, and the wish to do what's right and the wish to not do what's wrong. So that's good, that's wholesome. But guilt also often contains an unwholesome component of self-hatred, self-criticism, self-denigration, which is not good at all. That's actually unwholesome. It's aversion, it's hatred, it's hostility. It's not good at all. And that's also rooted in sense of self. It's rooted in self-centeredness. It's rooted in self-identity. So all of that is unwholesome. So we need to be able to piece those apart. So part of what makes guilt and shame so difficult to work with for many people is because it's not purely unwholesome. It's a mixture of wholesome and unwholesome components. And as long as we take it as a single package, then it's going to confuse us. It'll seem like something that we can't possibly throw away because we know it's got good stuff in it, but something which we also feel that it's poisoning us. It's eating away at us from the inside out. So it's good to recognize that guilt and shame are not a package deal. They're formed of separate components which can be pulled apart. So you can keep the good parts and throw away the bad parts. Okay?
All right. And Sarah says, I am just beginning to experience neutral feeling after starting regular meditation. I even find trying to enjoy things stressful. So I think you just answered my question. So thank you.
Good. Yeah, it's interesting. One person described cultivating mindfulness of neutral feeling, he described it as it's like a 2D picture becoming 3D. So the point he's making is that when you start to pay attention to neutral feeling, your experience of life becomes vastly richer and more complex and more interesting. Again, like a two-dimensional image becoming three-dimensional, or like a black and white photo becoming color. It's really fascinating. The more you pay attention to life, the more fascinating life is.
And that was the last question, but I have, unless something else appears, but I wanted to, I was thinking about this. Why do you think the counterpart of knowledge is liberation? A little bit.
So again, this is pointing to sequence. So as I mentioned, the word patibhaga has three distinct meanings. So patibhaga, it can mean opposite, it can mean partner, or it can mean like the result, like next in a sequence. So here it's being used in all three of these ways. And in order to try to communicate that it's the same word being used, then I chose the word counterpart. Okay. And just a little glimpse in the translator's mind, I spent, I don't know how long, trying to find an English word that would capture all three of these meanings, and I just couldn't find anything. Counterpart was the best I could come up with. So with something like this, it's always that question of, do you then translate it using three different words and have a footnote to try to indicate that it's all the same word? Or do you translate it using one word and then that either muddies the meaning or requires footnotes to explain the different shades of that one word?
My personal preference would be three separate words.
This might be a case where that's the best option.
With footnote. Yeah. Because at the very beginning, to me, everything is very sort of intuitive, and then I get a little bit confused. But that's just me. And Bradley says, I found that the meditation on the 6 elements helped with noticing neutral feelings. Interestingly enough, heat, wind, solidity, liquidity, spaciousness.
Yeah, I think that's because with each one of those, it's forcing us to pay closer attention to parts of our experience that we normally don't notice. So digging deeply into, like the wind element. It's like, well, I don't think of my body in terms of wind. So then we have to start actively looking for the experience of wind in the body, which then leads us to investigating our blind spots. Our experience is absolutely packed with blind spots. And most of it, we're not even aware that we have blind spots. We think that we're aware of our body and mind, but actually we're aware of only a tiny percentage of body and mind. So using methods which make us look at our body and mind in different ways, in unusual ways, can help to uncover a lot of these blind spots. So I'm happy to hear that the 6 elements is helping you out. That's a really fascinating way to practice.
Great. That was the last comment of the morning. Thank you so much, Bhante, for teaching us tirelessly the Dhamma. So we will be meeting again this evening at 7:30 p.m. and then again every morning and evening, both tomorrow, so Thursday and Friday. On Friday evening, we'll be having monk chat. So any questions you have about Dhamma or Dhamma related, you can bring them for monk chat on Friday evening, and then we'll be meeting again next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And have a great, as usual.